Washington and Tehran are ramping up their bellicose rhetoric from Iran. Leaders vow revenge for the assassination of their top general, have withdrawn Iran from the nuclear deal, and on Tuesday branded the U.S. Pentagon as a, quote, terrorist organization. Meanwhile, U.S. President Donald Trump warns of a, quote, disproportionate response and threatens Iraq with sanctions if Baghdad expels foreign troops. As for major powers like China, Russia, and the Europeans, they urge all sides to de-escalate tensions. So is a worst-case scenario coming? Has Iraq become a battlefield between the U.S. and Iran? And where is a peaceful path out of this crisis? To discuss these issues and more, I'm happy to be joined in the Beijing studio by Dr. Zhao Hai, a research fellow at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, via satellite from Washington by Richard White, a security expert at the Wikistrat Global Consultancy, and from Iran by Gamba Nadari, a columnist with KN International. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Yang Ray. Welcome to Dialogue, Dr. Zhao. The Iranian parliament has approved a kind of bill vowing to retaliate, and it's a matter of a national will and political consensus. There's no doubt about that. And with the current exchange of hate speech on both sides, Washington and Tehran, and particularly the escalation of bluffs, what do you think would be the worst-case scenario?
Well, first of all, I think on surface, like you said, each side is escalating by rhetoric. However, beneath the table, I think both sides don't want to escalate and particularly throw the whole region into chaos and have blood on the street. So even though we're thinking that if, sometimes both sides cannot control the situation on the ground, and things may escalate very quickly into a regional attack and counterattack. But I think like you said, all the major powers, and I think including Iran and the United States at this point, don't want to go there. However, how to de-escalate, that's a key question here.
I'm wondering aloud if the Chinese government could play a constructive role by bringing both sides, Washington and Tehran, to the table and talk about the sustainability of the new nuclear deal, right? The process of denuclearization in the Middle East. But let me cross over to Nadari. First of all, the same question for you. What do you think would be the end game? What would be the worst-case scenario given the current escalation?
Definitely, Iran is going to target U.S. bases and positions in the Middle East, especially in Iraq. This is a question of who gets to stay in Iraq. Definitely, Iran is going to do everything it can to expel U.S. forces from Iraq in cooperation with its proxy forces in Iraq, Syria, Yemen, and of course, Lebanon. But at the same time, just today, the High Council for National Security announced a new statement that made it absolutely clear that there are 13 possible scenarios for retaliation, and 38 U.S. bases are going to be hit or targeted under these 13 scenarios. So it is not a matter of if, but when and where. Definitely retaliation is on the table, and it has to happen because this is a face-saving measure for Iran. Iran, if it doesn't retaliate, it will have to deal with Trump and his bully boy members of the administration for a long time. We need to stop the bully, and this is the only way Iran has to do. Iran has to retaliate to stop them from pushing it around.
That is indeed a bloody logic for escalation of hostility. Let me cross over to Richard White. Do you believe under such adverse circumstances Washington would go even further by launching preemptive strikes, by eliminating all targets of military and strategic importance, either in Iraq in terms of the proxy forces of Tehran or inside Iran, so that their targets in the Middle East, I mean the American targets in the Middle East, would not be destroyed, would not be hit before it's too late? What do you think of the current bellicose rhetoric?
Sure. So that is certainly an option. I mean, even for force protection reasons, if it looks like an Iranian unit or a unit, and really any unit, whether it's linked to Iran or not, was about to attack a U.S. base, the U.S. commander would certainly consider a spoiling preemptive strike to prevent that attack from succeeding. I mean, I think that would be, the commander would be negligent if he or she didn't make such a command. I just also wanted to make a comment about the intro package. I wouldn't say that the Iraqi parliament was a national consensus decision. I mean, it was about almost half the deputies were not present. And so you have a lot of concern in the Sunni and Kurdish political leaders about what would happen if the U.S. forces entirely withdraw at this time.
I'm talking about deliberations in the Iranian parliament, not the Iraqi parliament. In Iraq, of course, you have the serious division between Shiites, Sunnis, and Kurds. But in Tehran, that's an entirely different scenario for members of parliament, right?
Yes.
Right. So is it true, Gamba Nadari, that members of parliament in Tehran have unanimously approved a bill vowing to retaliate no matter what?
That is, as you just mentioned earlier, this is a national will, and nobody is willing to jeopardize his political future against this national will. People on the streets, I've been witnessing for the past 3 days, millions of people took to the streets and they were all calling for revenge, retaliation. The leader has made it absolutely clear that revenge is the only way forward. The military brass, top military brass, made it absolutely clear over the past 3 days that they are going to take actions to matters into their own hands and make sure that America pays through the nose in the Middle East and beyond. As I told you, they are going to target many different positions and areas across the region, and it is not going to be limited to just Iraq. They are going to retaliate, because if they don't, then they will have to deal with more threats and targeting by the U.S. government and its army in the Middle East. Let's not forget the fact that Trump has threatened to hit Iran's cultural sites. He has threatened to target Iranian officials. You put yourself in the shoes of the Iranian government and officials. Imagine if it was Iran that had assassinated the Secretary of Defense of the United States. All hell would have broken loose. They would have immediately declared war on Iran. Iran is doing the same thing within the framework of international law and UN Charter. Make no mistake, Iran is going to retaliate. Iran's cruise missiles, Iran's medium-range missiles are now up and ready. They are ready to be fired. We don't know where they are going to hit their targets, but they are going to hit their targets, because it is a matter of life or death, politically speaking, for many officials here. They cannot, just talk about rhetoric. They need to walk the talk if they want to stay in their political businesses.
There's no doubt they're going to walk the talk. But Dr. Zhao, given the asymmetrical nature between the two militaries, the Iranian military and the American armed forces, rhetoric to retaliate, a matter of national will in the parliament, would be viewed as a move of a suicide, right? The Americans would easily launch preemptive strikes to prevent Iranians from hitting their targets in the Middle East. What do you think of the consequences?
Well, first of all, yes, I think if you compare the two militaries, of course, the U.S. has supremacy, not only globally, but also in the region. But I think on the region, particularly in the area that's close to Iran, Iran also has a regional limited upper hand in terms of launching small-scale attack and taking the revenge. The problems now is not only there's a political will, of course, backing up this kind of action. But the thing is, will the leadership in Tehran stop at certain level and not provoke or drag other parties in the region into a total war?
I'd rather ask Richard Wyatt a similar question as to whether President Trump is likely to be prevented from exercising the executive power in declaring war. What was the immediate response from Democrats in the D.C.? I mean, a spokesperson Madam Pelosi, she initiated the bill of impeachment, but what do you think of the current situation? What was the immediate response from Democrats, given the whims of the Trump presidency?
Right. So President Trump has not declared war with Iran. He does not have that authority, but the president does have the authority to use the U.S. armed forces, direct them, and so on. And in this case, that was what he did. But this struggle between the president and the Congress over who controls the ability of the U.S. to engage in foreign military operations has been going on for decades. The president says, well, I'm the commander-in-chief. I should need to be able to use forces immediately in a crisis, and then I don't need a congressional authorization for a direct threat, or there are already sufficient laws to allow that. The Congress says, no, what you're doing is potentially getting us into a war if you use force, in this case Iran, so we need to review and declare war. But the last time Congress declared war was in 1941 after Japan attacked the U.S. It just normally, given the nature of modern weaponry and how rapidly developments occur, that Congress won't have time to do that. So what we're seeing now is Congress trying to put some limits on what the president can do going forward, and the president resisting. For example, rather than send a formal authorization, he just tweeted that if Iran attacks, we're going to strike back disproportionately, and this is your notification. So this will continue. The Supreme Court refuses to decide because it's such a political question.
Dr. Zhao, what do you think of the enormous efforts by Democrats in the House to prevent President Trump from declaring war? As you said earlier, both sides, Tehran and Washington, have so far exercised utmost restraint in de-escalating the tensions, despite the bellicose rhetoric in the Iranian parliament. It seems neither Washington or Tehran stand ready to be fully engaged in the war.
This is the very peculiar situation, because previously Trump would refuse to get deeper into the Middle East. Actually, he wanted to pull troops out of Syria and also, if possible, even from Iraq and Afghanistan. So this time, people are asking why he's acting at this particular time.
Yeah, John Bolton was kicked out of the White House.
Yeah,
why he surprised the whole world?
So I think there are two factions now. American people actually supported his position on pulling Americans out of the Middle East, getting less entangled in that region. However, there's a group of elites in Washington, D.C., there are still neocon ideas in their minds. The hardliners wanted to go to war with Iran, escalating and get rid of the regime in Iran. That's the problem, and they are actually in conflict with Trump. And this particular time, because Trump is under such a pressure of impeachment, he's quite sentimental, I think, at this point. And they find a kind of break, get into his head and persuaded him to take this action to show his toughness. And once he's taking this road, there's no going back. And now Congress believes that they need to act to curb his sort of emotional and impulsive actions against Iran. That's how this thing would going to happen. So like we have discussed, if Iran launched an attack to American base and American personnel, then Trump would have to act again as a tough guy. Then that will escalate to no end. That's why Pelosi and Democrats are so worried about Americans as a whole would be dragged into this war that they don't want to.
Thank you very much. Let me go back to Gamba. Hello. What do you think of domestic politics of Baghdad? Because Prime Minister of the Iraqi government said, and in fact he complained bitterly, that Washington had asked the Iraqi government to invite General Soleimani to come over on a beautiful excuse, but this general was assassinated in the territory of Iraq, and therefore the appeal from Tehran to expel all foreign troops from the territory of Iraq. Now, do you think Iraq is likely to fall into a civil war, but with the strong presence of Shiite militias and the strong leadership of Sistani, the Grand Ayatollah there, what would happen to the domestic politics in Iraq?
Well, just like Iran, Iraq is a divided society among the Kurds, Sunnis, and of course Shias. General Soleimani was there at the invitation of the Iraqi officials for some kind of mediation between Iran and Saudi Arabia. He was carrying a message of peace and harmony with Saudi Arabia. He wasn't there to plot any kind of threats against American forces, unlike what fake news in the West would like to suggest, especially President Trump himself. He was there for peace and security, not just for Iran and Saudi Arabia, but also for Iraq. He didn't want to turn Iraq into a new battleground between the egos of President Trump administration officials and, of course, those of Iran. But unfortunately, he paid a huge price for his diplomatic efforts. But make no mistake, if Iran retaliates and America does some counter-retaliation, takes some counter-retaliation measures, we are going to see also Iraq turn into a battlefield. But this battlefield is not going to be limited to Iraq. It is going to cover the Persian Gulf waters, the Sea of Oman, and of course the rest of the Middle East. This is not what Iran wants. Today, the advisor of Iran's supreme leader made it absolutely clear that Iran doesn't seek an all-out war with the United States. But as you just mentioned, your distinguished guests made it absolutely clear things could get out of hand. We might not be able to de-escalate the situation
at this moment. We understand your anger. The whole world, except for us, the die-hard supporters of President Trump, would somehow show their sympathy for the death of your general. I'm not sure about the Europeans, but let's go back to the fundamental root cause behind the explosive situation between Washington and Tehran. I believe that both sides, some of the moderates in Tehran, in Iran, and all of the Americans are still licking the wounds of the 1979 Islamic Revolution, which led to the storming of American embassy and capturing 52 American diplomats, and they were held under house arrest in a very humiliating way for 444 days. This time around, similar cases were seen by American media in Baghdad. The American embassy was surrounded and attacked, it could not be compared strictly in the parallel with what happened back in 1979, but still Americans are still recovering from the nightmarish incident of the Islamic Revolution back in 1979. So under such a context, in such context, do you think there is some kind of a reason behind the extreme and disproportionate response from the White House and the Pentagon that led to the killing of your general?
You're absolutely right. It was a huge mistake on the part of the Iranian people, students, to take over the U.S. embassy back in 2080. It was a huge mistake for Iran to escalate the current situation. We had the time, we had the opportunity to normalize our diplomatic relations with the United States, especially after the JCPOA, the nuclear deal. But there were some hardliners here that didn't want that to happen. So they stopped that. Yes, of course, Iran is not 100% innocent. Iran made many mistakes, but as I told you, this general didn't deserve to die like this. This is the same general that helped the U.S. government officials and, of course, their army and forces to defeat the Taliban militants in 2001. It was the same general that helped the U.S. forces in Iraq and Syria to defeat the medieval butchers of ISIS and Al-Qaeda when the whole world was looking the other way, when U.S. government was kicking the can down the road. So this is the same kind of ally that until yesterday was a friend of the United States, but now he was assassinated because Trump said so. I think there are some internal politics also being played here. Trump wants to avoid impeachment. He wants to win re-election. He wants to get back to the White House. That's why he wanted a new conflict in the region in order to create some kind of a nationalism sentiment in the United States. But guess what? It backfired. In Europe, in 72 cities across the United States, people took to the streets to voice their anger and their opposition to any kind of war between Iran and the United States. Trump miscalculated his measures. He thought that he could get away with the impeachment process and, of course, get re-elected, but that is not going to happen.
The domestic reasons, an effort by President Trump to avoid being impeached through this preemptive assassination of a very senior general in Iran. Do you follow his logic. Where do you stand?
No, no, I don't see this as a decisive figure. I think you were more your initial reasoning fits a little better. That what we were been seeing in the past year is that President Trump does not want to get into a major foreign war in the Middle East. So when there was the shooting down of the U.S. drone, the missile strikes on the Saudi refineries, the shelling of the U.S. bases in Iraq, and so on, there would be protests, but no use of force. But I think that at some point, the President Trump was worried that this was just getting worse and worse. The Iranians were becoming overconfident. They were seeing him perhaps as the paper tiger. So he decided to take a very decisive counterstroke to reestablish the deterrence and his credentials and willingness to use force. And in his message, in one of his tweets recently, he did allude to the hostage crisis and saying, we don't want to proceed along this path. The domestic politics, it's not clear what impact this is going to have.
Richard,
on the one hand, it's going.
Richard, a few minutes ago, we heard Gamba Nedere sound a little bit apologetic in the case of the 1979 storming of the American embassy. He was several times on the program of dialogue apologizing for the mistakes that the Iranians made in 1979. I wonder if Americans could also apologize a little bit for the serious mistake that you guys made. For example, ahead of the invasion of Iraq, and Colin Powell, Secretary of State, former Secretary of State, gave a seriously flawed intelligence report based on what Mr. Shalabi, former opposition leader in Iraq, had provided. It was a seriously flawed intelligence report, and based on that, however, the United States launched preemptive strikes against, despite the opposition from Jacques Chirac, the French president, and Gerhard Schröder, a former chancellor of Germany. So what do you think of the mistakes that the Americans had made, and are you still licking the wounds? Have you kept in mind this serious lesson and try to avoid repeating the same stupid and expensive mistake?
I can say from the highest source, which is President Trump, that yes, he and others in the U.S. recognized the intelligence was flawed. Many argued that the invasion was a mistake, and certainly what happened afterwards when the U.S. let Iraq fall apart, basically, through poor post-occupation policies, is a root cause for the chaos we've seen since in Iraq. And so President Trump, as himself acknowledged, that these were all errors of policy.
Well, invasions, wars did occur since September the 11th terrorist attacks, and while the whole world showed their strong sympathy with the victims of the terrorist attacks, the deadliest terrorist attacks on September the 11th, 2001, Americans, we are wondering whether they are reflecting upon the mistake they have made, which led to people in their millions who have been left homeless internally and externally, hence the asylum-seeking tsunami contributing to the disaster for the political landscape in the European Union. Having said this, Dr. Zhao, what do you think of the possibility that this time around President Trump was wrongly briefed about General Soleimani?
Well, I think there's a possibility because it's kind of weird how many different choices he's been presented. Because apparently somebody in the DOD presented to him that the choice, that this possibility of killing General Soleimani is an option for him to do so. And comparing to other options, apparently President Trump chose this very extreme measure to be taken as a revenge on events that you described before, like the storming of the embassy and also shooting down of the drone. So this is very peculiar. And then, as some news outlet reported, apparently Secretary Pompeo played a very active role in persuading Trump of accepting this choice of killing General Soleimani. And I really doubt that he has enough time to explain to President Trump what would entail if he killed this very significant figure and a politician in the Middle East region. So I think this whole thing is very shrouded in cloud, and we need to have more information to clarify why would Trump make such a decision at this critical junction.
Earlier, Richard, I mentioned Mr. Shalabi, opposition leader during the Saddam Hussein years, and he provided Washington with misinformation about links, the false links between Saddam Hussein and Al-Qaeda. Based on his support, the United States military launched preemptive strikes and hence the ouster of Saddam Hussein. Now that also reminds the Chinese of the bombing of Chinese embassy in Belgrade. So Americans did apologize seriously to the Chinese authorities about the killing of 3 Chinese journalists in Belgrade. So time and again, Americans did make mistakes. What do you think of the prospects, I mean, the possibility this time around President Trump was briefed by mistake, one way or another, by his senior policymakers that General Soleimani should be the target for the killing?
Well, we don't, as your Chinese guest says, we don't know precisely what happened. We have press reports that the president was given a range of options to respond to the attack on the U.S. base and the killing of the U.S. contractor. And this option of targeting General Soleimani was something that's been offered for years, according to the media. So, and each time the decision was made, and despite his being responsible for killing hundreds of U.S. troops during the occupation and other reasons why he was actually on the U.S. terrorist list, it was decided the negative effects of killing him would outweigh the benefits. On this time, it flipped, and so you have to wonder what's changed. And then you could say, well, U.S.-Iranian relations are worse now than they were at the previous times that this issue came up. The situation in Iraq was deteriorating. The U.S. needed to take a bold action. So there are possible reasons. It could have just been anger on the president's part over what was happening. We don't know for sure yet. I'm sure it will come out at some point, but it's a bit early to know.
Gabriel Nadler, you only have 1.5 minutes to respond to the next question, the last one, before we conclude this interesting discussion about the relationship between Tehran and Iran, the increasing animosity, apparently, between the two sides. Now tell me, if Iranian government has appointed a very strong guy to replace General Soleimani, well, let me draw a clumsy comparison. Now, Baghdadi, the top terrorist, he was killed. I'm sorry for citing this example, but Baghdadi was replaced quickly by someone, but this successor was quickly killed by the Americans. I'm not drawing a parallel comparison, but let's follow the logic, a clumsy logic. Do you think the successor to General Soleimani is also likely to be the next target for American assassinations?
Absolutely, because Trump and his administration officials threatened already yesterday and the day before that more Iranian officials and military figures are going to be targeted. So they have made it absolutely clear that this escalation is far from over and behind us. I think we are going to take these threats seriously. China, Russia, and the rest of the international civil society should hold the U.S. government to account and try to do something about de-escalating the current situation. We have no choice. Otherwise, we will be all paying through the nose if these things get out of hand and turn into a major war.
Thank you so much. I believe your advice will be heeded seriously by the Chinese side. Your advice will be heeded by the Chinese side, at least at the UN General Assembly and perhaps an emergency session, because Russia and China are, after all, two of the P5 which are in a position to call for an emergency session to discuss the escalation of tensions between Washington and Tehran. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.